Welcome, audience, to the One Cell, One Light radio show with your host, Dr. Hildegarde Staninger, commonly known as Dr. Hildy. Today's show is going to be very special. I have a very special guest that is on the show who has pioneered in the identification of the DNA and other scientific validation tests and approaches in medicine to the topic of our show today, the Starchild Skull. And my special guest is Mr. Lloyd Pyes, and I would like to introduce him here at this time.
Thank you, Hildy. It's a very, very great pleasure to be with you. You do great work with your show, and I'm delighted to be a part of it.
I'm glad that collectively we're making history together, and with your special Starchild Skull, she's giving us history to look at, and at the same time share her life. And I'm just going to share with the audience that when you did your original testing, and we'll go into the history of where she was found and everything, but she's approximately 900 years old by carbon dating. Is that correct?
Yes, that part of it is correct, Hildy. It was indeed 900 years by carbon-14 dating of the two skulls that were found at separate times in separate labs. But I have to say that the Starchild Skull, we don't know its sex. We don't know if it was a male or a female, so we generally refer to it as an it, unfortunately.
Okay.
It isn't either one, and it's misleading to just pick a side like the universal male or the universal female. In this case, it's better to just go with the it and leave it at that until we're able to distinguish for sure what its sex was.
And I appreciate that very much, because I like being scientifically correct on the terms. At the same time, I appreciate that. Well, let me, before I share what I know and I read in your book, and audience, Lloyd has written this beautiful book, well documenting the scientific validations that are proposed in the book, and also what scientists and medical professionals, physicians, etc., have observed about the skull, and categorizing it, because we're looking at it as an unknown skull because it doesn't fit necessarily the normal human skull, no matter what the ethnic background is or the race is. And his book is The Starchild Skull, Genetic Enigma or Human Alien Hybrid. Very well written, a lot of information in it. So if you're looking at not only just human genetics and that aspect, but have a yearning for finding the unknown and possibly looking at other lives in other planets or other worlds, this is a very good book on allowing you to see how it was done scientifically to bring it to this date and time of the information involved around basically these two skulls. And I'm going to let Lloyd share with the audience the history of the skulls so they'll know what about them.
Well, the history is that they were found in about 1930 in a backcountry of Mexico, about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua, up near the Copper Canyon area, not in the Copper Canyon area per se, but close to it, like, say, Flagstaff relative to the Grand Canyon, high desert area. And it was just a small village that a girl of Mexican extraction was visiting in about 1930, but her parents had already come to the States and had moved to El Paso, Texas. So the family was coming back after they had gotten legal, and where the kids were coming to the village for the first time, and so they were told not to go out and look in the caves and mine tunnels in the area because it was dangerous. And so, of course, being a teenager, about 13, 14, 15, she couldn't remember later in life, she snuck off to see what it was all about. And in one of the mine tunnels, she found two skeletons, one lying on the surface of the mine tunnel, and she could see a mounded up amount of dirt beside it, and coming out of that mound of dirt was a skeletal hand wrapped around the upper arm bone of the skeleton lying on the dirt. So she scraped the dirt away. It was loose. It wasn't compacted by rain or anything. So with her hand, she was able to expose the skeleton in the dirt, which she found to be very unusual. And she assumed, as anybody would in 1930, that it was just some kind of weird deformity. But she called it misshapen. It was a misshapen skull, misshapen hands, misshapen body. Misshapen was her word when she described it later in life. She managed to get the two skulls back into the States, and she kept them as souvenirs for her whole life. There's more to the story than that. I'm just giving you the shortened version.
Right, you're giving us the condensed version.
The condensed version. She brought them back. She kept them basically in a cardboard box her whole life, just as souvenirs. She shellacked them to keep, preserve them, which was a good thing because it preserved the DNA very well. And so she found out she was going to die in the early 90s, and she wanted somebody to keep the skulls. Her husband wasn't very comfortable with them, so she gave them to some friends. They kept them for about 5 years. They weren't that comfortable with them, and in 1998, they gave them to Ray and Melanie Young. Now, Melanie, Melanie had been a neonatal nurse for about 15 years. Up to this point, everybody assumes that the strange-looking skull is just some kind of human deformity that they don't know the name of, but it's got to be that, and that's the end of it. Melanie knows better. She knows what deformity is supposed to look like. She knows this is not a normal human deformity. It's very symmetrical. Everything about it that she can see surface-wise is different. It's too light. It's way too light for a normal human skull. In every way, Melanie is convinced this is not a typical human deformity. And more than that, she and her husband Ray are members of El Paso MUFON, Mutual UFO Network organization. So they know a little bit about UFOs, and more than a little bit, in fact. And so she says, this skull looks like it would fit perfectly in the head of your standard, typical, prototypical gray alien. And he said, you're right. And it was true. It has the large bulbous area in the crown, but with a crease down the middle of it. It has the very narrow lower face that comes almost to a point in every way, and it has weird, strange eye sockets. So in every way, it just seemed to have the outward trappings of your typical gray alien skull. So they took it to a couple of experts, quote, experts in the El Paso area who should have known what they were looking at, and they said, this is just a cradle-boarded hydrocephalic, don't worry about it. They both said the same thing, and which I heard later many times and still do to this day. You will hear experts try to say that it's a cradle-boarded hydrocephalic, when in fact, instantly you can tell, anybody that knows anything about either malady can tell it's neither cradle-boarded nor hydrocephalic, because hydrocephaly is water on the brain, which is actually spinal fluid on the brain, but it creates uniform pressure. As the pressure builds, it's uniform. It's like blowing up a balloon. There are no creases left in a hydrocephalic skull, and you look at the Starchild, and right away you see that crease in the top of the crown, and you know that couldn't be the result of hydrocephaly. And as far as cradle boarding, that's strapping an infant's head to a board so it can be put on the back of the mother as she has to work. And because the child's skull bones are so soft, they take the flattened shape of the rear of the head. And you can look at and they're as flat as the board. The head ends up as flat as the board that it's pressed against. It's tied down to. Starchild has.
Excuse me, Lloyd, but with cradle boarding, which is another feature that was brought out in your book, that a normal human skull audience usually have what they call between the eye sockets an L shape, and the Starchild skull did not have that L shape. But with cradle boarding, which is done in 100 years or longer through Native American heritage, they would use the cradle board, but the eye sockets would be the same, L shape.
Sure, nothing would change except the flattening of the rear of the head to the smoothness of a board. But the Starchild clearly has all of its natural convolutions back there. But more importantly, cradle boarding, the board could go only as far as the inion at the rear of the head. If everybody listening to me right now just reaches around to the rear middle of the rear of your head, you'll feel a knot, an absolutely distinctive knot back there. It's called your inion. And right below it, you'll feel the muscles of your neck because that's where your neck attaches. That inion is a buttressing element for big muscles that attach there. So the cradle board could not go beyond that inion, could not go, because then it would rip the neck muscles loose. That wasn't going to happen. So that's where the flattening stops, just above the inion. Starchild doesn't have an inion, so its flattening goes right down to its neck, to the foramen magnum, to where its spine comes into its skull. Again, anybody that knows anything about this could see that this is not standard cradle boarding. So that is still what experts pretty much hang their hats on, that, well, it's got to be, it has expanded parietals, it has to be the result of hydrocephaly, and it has a flat rear of its head, and it has to be cradle boarded, and that's that, and don't bother us anymore. And we've been living with that now for 13 years. But nonetheless, back to the story. So Ray and Melanie were told by experts it was a cradle boarded hydrocephalic, and just forget about it, not special at all. And so they would not take no for an answer. And so they began to look around for somebody in the field of alternative knowledge who knew a little bit about skulls, and my name came to them, and they invited me to come take a look at it. And when I saw it, I thought, too, that it had to be some kind of deformity, because if it wasn't, if it was what Melanie thought, if it was the skull of a gray alien, then, you know, that was like finding the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I just didn't think that I was going to take a place in history of that size. And yet, by the end of that, and that was in February of '99. By the end of that year, they offered it to me, and they said, "We want to know what it is. If you'll take it out and take it to experts and find out, you know, we'd appreciate it." And I said, "Sure, I want to find out too." So I began to take it to experts of varying kinds, various experts with various parts of human skulls, and in every case, the experts would say, "Well, I have to admit, I can't explain my part of it, but it's all together, it's got to be some kind of deformity. But, yeah, I've never seen eye sockets like this, or, yeah, I've never seen inner ears like this, or, yeah, the bone's really too thick, or, yeah, the brain clearly is not like our brain." And, you know, every one of them, his area was never seen anything like it, but collectively it had to be some kind of deformity. Well, by the end of all that, I understood that there's not a single physical feature of the Starchild skull, not a single physical feature of the Starchild skull that is exactly like a human, not one. And so I knew by the end of that year that we had something very, very special there. But what the mainstream people kept saying to me when I would try to say, "Hey, look, this thing is incredible. This is amazing. You should be jumping all over this." And what that would say is, "Look, no matter what you come up with on this, we are able to say with perfect authority, nature can do anything. Nature can do absolutely anything nature puts its mind to doing. And so there's your answer, Mr. Pye. Nature can do anything. Why are you even bothering us with this?" And so one guy said, "I don't care if you stack up 10,000 of these differences." By then I had 24 really primo differences lined up. And he said, "I don't care if you stack up 10,000. I'm still going to say nature can do anything, and why are you bothering me with this problem?" And so that's kind of where it was with mainstream science everywhere I turned with it. And one guy said, he says, "These physical things, you're never, ever, ever going to prove your case finding these physical differences. The only thing anybody will have any respect for is DNA." But in 1999, DNA was in its infancy relative to where it is now, and it wasn't capable of dealing with DNA that wasn't human or wasn't entirely human. They could find some pieces that were human, but they couldn't tell you what it was. There was just no way. And so we had to wait many years of those 13 years were waiting just for the DNA technology to catch up so that the Starchild DNA could be analyzed in full like any other creature of Earth. But now we're at that point, and so now we're where we just need the money really to have the sequencing done, have the recovery and the sequencing done, and find out exactly how much and to what degree it differs from normal human DNA. And we have very strong indications because we've had partial recoveries. So in those partial recoveries, we have very strong indications that the Starchild's difference from human could be anywhere from several 100% to who knows how many hundreds of percent difference, but very, very different. So different that there's no way you can call it anything other than alien.
Right. And also in this genetic analysis that you have done, you've also compared it to other animals, example audience, like an orangutan, a chimpanzee, and it didn't match those animals either. Being something that is close to, I'm going to say, a shape of the skull, in light terms, because now with the advancements of DNA, audience, it is so advanced that now they have the libraries, which are the history envelopes, as to say, or books of what different genetic makeup code of the DNA would be for different nationalities, different plants, different animals, etc. So it's more specific than what it was, like you said, in 1999. And also, it still costs money because it's all custom and specialized work. Versus just putting in a normal blood cell analysis, red blood cell for like HLA genes, and comparing it to already an existing data bank. It takes money and a while, but I know the cost went from millions down into 100,000s, but it's still significant for what you're doing in your private research and the funding of that research.
Well, it's more complicated than that, Hildy. When you take you're right. The price has dropped dramatically over time. Dramatically. But that's for fresh, living DNA that is basically intact. That the strings are all together, and
Correct.
It's a fairly easy read. And they have that the price of that down now. A full genome read is down in the range of $10,000. I think the last I heard. Could be done for $10,000. So but that's when it's easy to do. With the Starchild, when it's been dead for 50 years, the cutoff point for ancient DNA is 50 years. Anything beyond 50 years becomes really, really difficult. But actually, anything beyond 10 years is really difficult because when you die, what happens is there are bacteria in your body that are going to go to work on breaking you down into your component and elements, really dust to dust. And there, of course, flies and things that are in carrion that can eat you. But when you die in normal circumstances and nothing happens except you just lay there and rot away in normal, out in the wild somewhere, within a matter of weeks, it's astounding because they have the body farm up in Tennessee and they know how this all works. You're really gone. You are gone down to nothing. They're bacteria and molds and fungi that will eat your bones down to nothing. So when you die, right away, there are bacteria that go to eating you up, eating your cells up. And so in that process, like you've all seen cats and dogs eat at a plate of food, and there's always a little something dripped off on the side on the floor that they miss. Well, that's kind of how the DNA gets left and broken up into little small tiny pieces. It's all there because there's just so much of it, but the bacteria aren't there assigned to eat the DNA per se. So you've got these pieces left that you can recover, but they're in fragments, and so it becomes very difficult to get them all. And in one sequencing run, you can't do it. So like with the Neanderthal, let's say, where the strings are down into the teens of base pairs long, they've done what? How many hundreds of runs through the machines have they gone, through the Illumina machines? I don't know. But when they lay them all down, those hundreds of results, they're getting some results on every run. And when the computers can crunch the numbers and put it all together, in the end, you get one fairly intact string of the DNA that's left in the Neanderthal. Now, the Starchild is much easier than that to put together. Our people estimate that they will need anywhere from 30 to 50 runs probably to get it, maybe more, but it's going, and as you said, that's a very expensive process. But in the end, you do get it. You do get what you're looking for. So we're standing right now on the edge of creating history as big as you can create history All we need is the wherewithal to hire the people to do the work that needs to be done.
Right. And as you mentioned, the breakdown of bacteria with breaking down muscles, the decomposition of the human body, or as with the Starchild, were you able to recover any bacteria, meaning any of the genetics that match certain bacteria or anything, or did you have?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, when the geneticist is shot, all our geneticist has been able to do, because he operates out of his own pocket on his own time, because we don't have the money to pay the enormous amounts that it takes to do this correctly, but he shotguns it, and out of that comes results that are like close to 95 to 99% bacteria and contamination from other human beings. But one of the great things that the recovery of the Neanderthal genome has taught all geneticists is how to weed out the bacteria and the human contamination, because and find the Neanderthal. And in their case, by the way, it's 99% and more contamination, finding the Neanderthal, but they're able to do it. And so now anybody can do it that knows how to do it. So our guy knows how to do it. He specifically studied and learned how to do that because he knew he was going to be confronted with it. And so he finds between 95 to 99% is contamination by bacteria and human contamination, but he does find Starchild DNA that's clearly distinctive from those others, and it's only because they've done the work to know what the bacteria signatures look like, and so it's very easy to weed them out.
Yes, and that's important because it gives a better history in the story of the Starchild Skull. Also, I know, and I don't know if this is jumping the gun on it, but since we're talking specifically of the skull, in the analysis that was performed on it, and audiences was using energy dispersion and scanning electron microscope micrographs for comparative analysis, you found that it had more, I'm going to call it like air pockets in the formation of the enamel, and as you stated earlier in the show, that it was lighter than the human's skull. It was distinctively different in the chemical composition of the elements that were found in it, from what I observed.
Yeah, well, you have it a little bit wrong, but not too wrong. One of the distinctively different things about the Starchild is its bone, is the composition of its bone. Its bone is clearly, without question, 1/2 or less than the thickness of normal human bone. Wherever you look in it, it's 1/2 or less what it is in a normal human thickness. But it weighs half as much. So something has gone on. I mean, the weighing the half as much is okay in terms of the size, but what is different about it biochemically is it has much more collagen squeezed into it than any human bone has. Much, much more collagen. Now, collagen is the thing that holds basically your bones together. Where you find that level of collagen in the human body is in tooth enamel. You can find a sort of an equal sample of collagen in tooth enamel. So the Starchild bone, while much thinner and much lighter, is actually 2 to 3 times harder. We don't yet have that scaled exactly, but I can tell you from having cut it by hand with a saw, I needed about 200 strokes on the Starchild bone to cut the same length with the saw that I cut in about 50 with the human bone. It's very much harder. And everybody that's ever cut it, I'm not the only person that's ever cut it. About 5 other people have cut it, and they all say the same thing. Wow, this is hard. It's like cutting sheet metal. And it is. So, science has so many things about this skull that they should be jumping all over, but they're not. Because let's move ourselves into the future a little bit. Somebody gives us the money we need. And we get the testing done, and we do the documentary films, and everybody on the mainstream is forced to accept the reality of the Starchild Skull as an alien being that lived and died and was buried on the earth 900 years ago. All right? Now, they're going to say, well, that doesn't mean they're here now, by God. You'll hear all that, but they're going to have to accept that at least once, 900 years ago, there was an alien here. And so when you accept it as real, you have to, then it's going to be like Otzi the Iceman. They're going to be banging down the door, begging and pleading for samples to do this. Let me try this, let me try this, let me try that, And one of the first things they're going to want to do is use the collagen to try to figure out how does the Starchild have so much more collagen in its bones than we do, and figure out a way to put it in us so that you can pretty much eliminate arthritis in older people. You can increase the tensile strength of bones such that maybe they won't break so easily in sports and everything else. I mean, you can change human reality, human existence, if you can just change the strength of our bones 5%, 10%, 15%. I mean, who knows what will come out of the research of the Starchild in that one thing alone. But humans have over 4,000 genetic disorders. Over 4,000 genetic disorders. Now, what if we open up Starchild's genome and recover it and find that in the areas where a lot of those genetic defects occur, it has stretches that are significantly different. Who's to say those stretches aren't much better than ours, aren't perfect, aren't what ours need to be, or some aspect of them, and maybe they, over time, I'm not talking 2 years from now or 3 years from now, but over time, we might be able to diminish within the human genome, or at least within humans, a lot of those 4,000 genetic disorders. If we get to the point where when a human child is born, and there are a series of tests to determine 20, 30, 50, or more of these things that we've learned how to correct through the Starchild, then you immediately can get to work with stem cells on this kid that will fix all those things. And, we can improve our genetic stock immensely over time with something like the Starchild Skull. Now, why isn't science jumping all over it? Not because they don't want to do things like that, but because they don't want to have to acknowledge that there are others out there, because it shifts the whole dynamic of human reality. That's what we're up against.
Right, and it would put major changes in the new fields of nanotechnology and nanomedicine, which they're looking at doing, just like you said, with stem cells, and also hydroxyapatite, or I said that name wrong, meaning the types of enamels.
Hydroxyapatite,
where they can hepatite, where they can mix that with certain compounds so that it can increase the collagen, etc. This way, by injecting like artificial bone or certain artificial muscle, so that it can grow appropriately when you've had injury or tear of the muscle, or a broken bone that can't be put together because a certain amount of it's missing. And that a lot has been going, but I can see the opportunity of the technology development around the Starchild Skull, and also the avenues of business. And there's many opportunities that way once you get all the stuff determined. Also, in speaking of the skull, because of the way the size of the skull was, it was brought out in the book, and also in other shows that you've been on, that the intelligence possibly of this child was higher than a human's intelligence because of the neuron mass that it could have.
Right. Well, first of all, let me say that it wasn't a child either. Even though we call it the Starchild, it was an adult, and so we can call it as that. But I used to make those mistakes as well, because we just didn't know, and we've learned as we've gone along. But as far as the brain goes, the brain is another very, very significant aspect of difference between the Starchild and a human. Its size is the size of an average 12-year-old, average human 12-year-old, or an adult human of about 5 feet or less tall, a small human. So it's a little bit less than normal, your skull, my skull, average person's skull. Now, our skulls average hold a brain of 1,400 cubic centimeters. It has a brain volume, we do, of about 1,400 cubic centimeters. Of that size, and the human skull found with the Starchild was exactly the same size. It was a human of about 5 feet tall. Its brain volume is indeed 1,200 cubic centimeters. So the Starchilds should hold about 1,200 cubic centimeters. So I remember the day when we were filling the skulls with birdseed to determine their volume. I was with a brain expert, and he was saying, well, he did the human one first. He says, well, they're the same size, and this one's got 1,200 cubic centimeters, and so your Starchild's going to have about that because you see the parietals are expanded, and that's some more additional room, but the back is flattened, so that's less room, so should be about 1,200 all the same. So I said, okay, fine. So he put in the birdseed, and he poured it out, and then he started scooping it into the measuring tube, and we hit 1,200, and there was still a lot more. He says, wow, look at that, still a lot more to go, and we're already at 1,200. 1,400, he says, wow, that's average, and we still got more to 1,600 cubic centimeters of brain in the Starchild skull that should hold 1,200. That's fully one-third more than it ought to have. So he was flabbergasted by that. But even more importantly, when he stuck his fingers in the foramen magnum and reached around to the backside of the skull, in our skulls we have the curve back there, and we have these ridges that are in there to hold our cerebellums in place over the course of our lives, because they're our software. That the human software is in the cerebellum. That's really what runs us. Our automatic systems, our blood coursing through our bodies, our breathing, our things like that, things that we don't think about but just run all the time. That's our cerebellum. It's got most of the neurons. It's a very, very important part of our brains. And so he said it's well protected. It's got thick bone back there. It's got the extra neck muscle. It's got the inion. That the cerebellum is well cared for. But he says in this thing, look, he says there's no those ridges are down. There's no inside. There's no nothing to support the cerebellum against all that weight sliding straight down the back of the head toward the neck hole. He says it's like a slipper slide. If that was a human brain, it would be pushing right out of the neck hole because there's nothing to hold it in, and it's so much heavier than it should be for that size. And he says, and yet, here you go. You've got yourself a living being that didn't die young. And he says, so that tells me one of two things. This thing doesn't have a cerebellum the way we have a cerebellum, or if it does, the material that makes up its brain and its cerebellum is much harder, much thicker, much stronger than ours, or else it would go sliding out of the neck hole from the pressure. And so, bingo, we had another major discovery right there.
Right, and that's from the morphology of the skull, audience, and just comparative physiological observations as compared to a human skull as we know it. And I should clarify, too, that as other human skulls, meaning whether it's Neanderthal or, Louis the 16th, if we had his skull, or anybody's, it is definitely different than a human skull and different than certain primate animal skulls. Correct?
Right. It's not like any chimp skull. It's not like a gorilla skull. It's not like anything. It's more like a human than anything else, but it's nothing like a human, if that makes sense. It's somewhere between a chimp and a gorilla and a human. It's closer in that sense, but it's still dramatically different in every aspect than a human. It's not a human. It's what you would expect an alien to be. That is what the Starchild is.
Right. In the observations, even in the diagrams, and also taking, I'm going to say, molds and putting overlays through artist rendition of what it could be, the actual physical face of the Starchild. Also, I'd like you to bring out, Lloyd, for our audience, that there was also another piece that was broken off from the skull, which was the jaw area, and two things that were brought out that I've read in the book, and also that you brought out on a show that you did in England. The thing is that in reference to the ear hole, which is in the skull, and also that it didn't have, by the way the mouth would form, that it was not necessarily as with a tongue and apparatus like we have, that we can eat food like that, versus more of, I'm going to say liquids, or more of a different type of tongue or jaw.
Well, there are some very interesting issues about that, Hildy, that you bring up. Yes, it was not a piece of the jaw; it was a piece of the maxilla, which is the upper jaw.
That's it. Maxilla,
put your finger, all of you who are listening, put your finger in the middle under your nose in that little dip in the top of your lip, and sweep your finger around the right side of your mouth. That upper jaw is called your upper right maxilla, the maxilla. That's the part of the Starchild skull that was recovered. So it had two teeth that were visible down, that it had been using to eat with, and it had four crowns up in the bone, and it's a very small piece of bone too, and yet it had teeth up in the bone and teeth down. So the reason we called it the Starchild was when the very first test that we had done in February of 99 was to have some very detailed x-rays, and the x-ray technician said, well, look, you got teeth down, you got teeth up in the bone there, so this has got to be a child in the range of 5 or 6 years old, somewhere in there, and so that's why we started calling it the Starchild. But later we found out from experts who were more knowledgeable about teeth than this guy was. They said, well, if you look at the structure at the surface of the teeth themselves, they're pretty chipped up. They are well worn. They have striations in the enamel that are known as crazing, cracks in the enamel that are known as crazing. You have chips on the enamel that clearly come from eating food that had been ground, with a mortar and pestle with stone. It was grit. So these teeth are pretty well worn. These are not the teeth of children. It takes a while to stress teeth like this much. And so, okay, we're looking at an adult. But when you look at the little piece of maxilla that we have, if you double it over, and if you go to I'm not sure that we have this photo in the book, but if you go to the ebook, the Starchild Skull Essentials ebook, I'm pretty sure that you can see a doubled over picture of the maxilla and see that the roof of its mouth is basically flat. I mean, there's no arch like we have. It's just flat across.
Right, which can be from a human side. Let me interject, Lloyd. From a human side, if you don't have that arch, you have sinus problems, you have olfactory, sensory problems, and also different developmental problems as you go into puberty because of the types of chemicals that have to interact with the limbic system during that time. So that's a very
and there's got to be room. There has to be room for your tongue as well to operate
Correct.
and hold its position.
Correct.
And so it's a little odd to have a flat roof like. But by the way, you mentioned sinuses. The Starchild has no sinuses. I mean, no vestiges of frontal sinuses at all. So it's kind of unusual in that sense that it is missing those in every particle. So just another strange thing about it. But as far as the roof of the mouth, so there you go. You've got not much room for a tongue. So if it has a tongue, it doesn't have a big tongue, but it seems to show the signs that it was eating. So it's eating, and if it's like us, it has a tongue. If it's not like us, well, then it doesn't have a tongue. But also, too, with the sinuses, another thing that's very interesting about the lack of frontal sinuses is this. What are your sinuses good for, do you suppose? This was a surprise to me, and it's a surprise to almost everybody that I talk to. You think that your sinuses are somehow cleaning mechanisms for the breath as you're breathing, from the air, and when you're sick, it helps to somehow you to get better, your sinuses drain and all that. Well, they're really not. They're just germ bags, really is what they are for when you're sick. They just make you sicker, really. What your sinuses are good for is to make your voice resonate, to give your voice the quality that you hear as I'm speaking now. Because if I had no sinuses, I would sound something like this. I would sound like one of those robot voices or something like that, because I wouldn't have the resonating capacity. So when you size all this up, you begin to think the extra brain, the small mouth and tongue, and the lack of sinuses, maybe the star child didn't need to talk. Maybe it didn't talk. Maybe it communicated with what?
Telepathy.
Telepathic, exactly. And it seems to have everything it would need physically to do that. We can't prove it, obviously, but there you go. It's kind of coincidental that the things you need or don't need are there. The extra brain is there, the lack of speech, and I'll go you one better. Its neck is clearly 1/2 or less the size of a normal human neck. Now, that is all very, very interesting, especially when you look at pictures of prototypical grays, and they have all that. They have that very skinny neck, that very big head sitting balanced perfectly over this skinny little neck. There you go. And that's exactly what the Starchild had. So physically, we could, if science had been open and willing to deal with this question the way they would be Otzi, because he's quote normal, we would have had all this being researched and analyzed seriously since 1999. But because science is so terrified of this subject of alien reality and doesn't want to deal with it before they absolutely have to, we've just been wandering around in the wilderness, like Moses for 13 years, trying to get somebody to pay attention to us, and they just ignore us. That's how it always is. First they ignore you as long as they can, and then when they have to confront you, they will ridicule you as much as they can, and then ultimately when you roll over them with the truth, they'll say, oh, it was self-evident all along, and one of them will take credit for it. That's how it's going to happen.
Right, and because this type of approach that you've done in reference to the science side and documenting it so well, the thing is, too, the reality is that what I'm saying is it is pointing that it is not human, et cetera, this way, audience. But if it was proven that there was another form of life than what we know it 900 years ago, that changes a lot of paradigms within our global society, our religion, a lot of changes, and that might be an impacting factor too. With I'm going to say the average science community that way, because they'd have to explain a lot.
Well, the average. Let's be honest about it. The average science community, of which you're not a part, but you came up through the ranks, so you know the story. They've all drunk the Kool-Aid. I mean, Reverend Jim told them to line up and drink it, and they drank it. And so they are brainwashed to believe that this is not true and can't be true. And, I mean, I deal with these folks and have on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, that is the only way to describe it is brainwashing, because if they have drunk the Kool-Aid, they go ballistic that you would even think to challenge what they consider absolute reality. Now, unfortunately, this is how you move forward. It isn't the way science does, which is we'll move forward when we all feel like going forward. It's we move forward when somebody on the outside figures something out that the mainstream doesn't want to handle, and it just gets crammed down their throats, and then they will deal with it, and that's what's going to happen with this, just like so many other things in the past. Mm-hmm. I mean, the stories of scientific reluctance to deal with different paradigms and different realities are legion, and yet their propaganda machine has everybody believing that, oh, boy, they're right out on the cutting edge with a machete in their hands, just whacking away at the forest of ignorance, and boy, we just can't wait to get out there. When, in fact, they are just sitting back in their chairs at the camp and letting somebody else go out there with the machete hacking away, and they're just relaxing, taking it easy, because they don't want any big change in the status quo. And if there's going to be a major change in the status quo, alien reality is going to provide that. And so they're just kind of waiting. We're just kind of waiting. But eventually somebody is going to hear somebody with money, obviously with money, is going to hear that we have this need, and they're going to come forward and say, yeah, okay, I want to know, and show me how I can help, and we'll do that, and and then we'll be off to the races.
Right, and I hope that opportunity comes very soon for you that way.
Can't come soon enough. We've been ready for about almost a year now, so anybody out there that can help, send it our way. We're easy to find.
Yeah, and we're about the funding of it, so we'll put it in the little box and manifest it telepathically.
Absolutely,
okay?
Absolutely.
Where I mentioned earlier, not only with the mouth, but it had also observations, and I think this is important for the audience, in reference to the hole in the skull, in reference to where the ears would be, because they were larger, correct?
No, the holes, they're shifted to a different position, but the inner ears are twice the size of normal human inner ears. And that would, you'd wonder, well, what would it need that for? Well, if it's going to have that big head balancing on that little skinny neck, probably it would need maybe some better mechanisms for balancing that. Or maybe if its bones were thin and light but strong, but it had a much thinner body, then maybe it needed it for as well. We really don't know what its balance mechanism would have been like, but it would have been significantly different just because of the design of the head being so different from ours and being sitting absolutely centered up on top. Human necks, our skulls don't center on our spines because our faces are hollow in front. There's a lot of hollow space in the front of our face. So it's like a fat kid and a skinny kid on a seesaw. You have to misbalance it to make it fit right. So the neck in a human, the spine has to enter rear from center by about 1.5 inches to make up for that hollow space in the front of our faces. With the Starchild, it doesn't have sinuses. It has very shallow eye sockets. We haven't talked about that, but it has very shallow eye sockets. So it's not empty in the way that we are up front. So the skull, and plus it's got that caved-in rear of the head. So the spine has to move forward, and it's centered dead center under that skull for both forward and backward movement and left to right movement. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. And here's something of interest that somebody pointed out to me that I didn't know, but when they did, I thought, wow, that really makes sense. If you take a baseball bat, now mind you, and you hold it perfectly vertical in your hand, so that you're holding down at the bottom of the baseball bat, and you're holding it perfectly straight up and down, and you just hold it out from your body, you can hold it a pretty good while because all of its weight is draining right down through your hand. But if you tilt it off of dead center 2 or 3 degrees, or 5 degrees, or 10 degrees, it gets harder and harder and harder as its center of gravity moves out away from your hand. And that's what the Starchild Skull head and neck arrangement is. It's a baseball bat over the neck. All of that weight is centered going straight down the neck. It's perfect. Now, if it's a deformity, I would say this to people. If this is a deformity, how did it just so happen to so perfectly deform that it could do this? I mean, you can say this about any part of it. And the old nature can do anything. I mean, it's maddening to hear this glib answer that they've been taught to give to puzzles that they don't know how to answer. It's no different than religious people when you hit them with something in the Bible that doesn't make sense. It's God's will. It's God knows what He's doing. God can do anything. God can do anything. He can do anything. There's no difference between those two. There is no difference. They just hide behind it because it's the easy way out, and it keeps them from having to confront things that make them uncomfortable. Period.
Yeah, that's true. Their comfort factor may be a little different than the adventurous factor of trying to determine what it is. Even if you don't know what it is, just try to use all the tools that we have humanly possible here on this planet to assist in this matter. And I know with like with the woolly mammoth, when that was found in Siberia, a lot of other scientists got involved. Just like you said in reference to the caveman that was found, it was involvement versus outside of your own private funders and private researchers or private anyone or even private owners of it. That's been the only help that you've gotten, I think, from at least what I've read and also what
absolutely.
I've observed.
I've had a handful of scientists that have helped. Don't get me wrong; they're not all complete dithering cowards. They're not all. Most of them are, but not all, and I want to be very clear on that. I've had help from at least a dozen that has been very significant, very useful. And I, my hat's off to them, and others that have been willing to put their names on it as well. So it isn't all of them, but it's the majority, the vast majority. They just don't want to deal with it, don't want to have anything to do with it, would just tell me to, hit the door and, it's really a shame how terrified they are of their peers, because it's really peer disapproval that is causing this. They know they're not supposed to fool with these things. Even if they go that night home and tell their significant other, honey, you won't believe what I saw today, but for the most part they understand that if they get involved in it, they're risking their careers. I mean, they're absolutely risking their careers. So that every one of them that did, for me, I really, really deeply, profoundly appreciate and respect them for that. And I don't know what else to say except my hat's off to all of them. I just wish they all were like that, but they're not. Most of them are just pragmatic, cowardly, basically people who will let others deal with this until it's safe. But as soon as it's safe, as soon as all the landmines are removed or have been exploded by somebody, and it's safe to deal with this, like it's equivalent safe to deal with Otzi, I'm telling you, they will be lining up, screaming at the door, trying to get a piece of the action. They will, because then once it's okay, then everybody's going to realize, oh, well, this is going to be one of the biggest stories in history. I need to get on this if I can, and so they will.
Yeah, they jump on the bandwagon then after all the...
It's easy to jump on a rolling bandwagon. It really is.
And a lot of sometimes these factors, especially from the aspects of the commercialization or the industrialization of it, as you shared at the beginning of the show, that's when a lot of individuals or researchers like to steal information or anything like that, because then they can patent or they can do things faster.
We're very aware of those issues, and we're already, fortunately we're aligned with some geneticists who know how the game is played, and they know that we do have to keep those things under wraps, certain aspects of it, and we will. I mean, they know what to do, what they can release and not release, and it's not my game. That's their game.
No. I understand. Yeah. I'm just sharing with the audience that there's many aspects that can occur from whatever the findings are as you progress in those findings.
Absolutely. There will be more attention paid to this, especially as they begin to understand the medical possibilities. It'll be unreal. It'll just be unreal. I'm glad that I won't really have to do anything as far as that aspect of it goes.
Yeah, but you'll always be involved with it. It's like a part of your...
Well, I'll always be associated with it, but I would like to do some other things with whatever time I have left in my life. I've been doing this for 13 years. I'm ready to get rid of it as soon as I can, to put it off and let other people handle it. I mean, I've just got to get it over this final money hurdle, and once I get it over that and we get it out there and we establish it and prove it for real, I'm not needed anymore, really. I can go do other things, and others who are more qualified will take it on into the realm of pure science where it's going to be from that point on.
Yes, I would like you to bring out, I know we've touched on the genetic side, but in reference to, as you called it, a gray, because we're familiar with that shape from all of the movies we've seen, even from the movie Paul, which he would fit.
Which I love, by the way. That was a great
I love
movie.
that movie. That's my favorite. That and Thor this past year are my favorite, at the cusp of Puss in Boots. But the thing is with the genetics too, that one is it can be, I'm gonna use this loosely, its own species or a hybrid of a human alien or human, and audience, we're calling alien because it doesn't match anything we found on Earth. Correct, Lloyd?
Right.
And the human side, I know you've described. I don't know if it'll be easy on over the radio show, but we're going to have audience diagrams of what Lloyd is discussing in reference to how you were able to recruit the mother DNA versus the father.
Right. Well, we can talk about that. Or do we want to do a break first and then come back with that?
We're going to be
fairly
coming on a break. Yeah, we'll cover that on the second half. We've got about 5 more minutes before we go into the next half.
Because that's a very complicated subject of figuring out.
Yes.
Discussion to figuring out of the mother's DNA, the father's DNA, the combined DNA, and all that. It is complicated, and it's better to wait till we have a larger block of time to get into it.
Great. We'll cover that on the second half. And I know you've done, and we might need to have it on the second half too, in reference to it had unique fibers and different shape hooks and claws. I'm using that as a loose term to distinguish it just from a fiber as like a piece of thread in its skull composition, or where it would attach or different areas of the
woven through the matrix of the bone are fibers that are like rebars in concrete to add strength to it. And remember, I was talking about how strong it is. An additional factor, in addition to all of the collagen, are those fibers woven through the matrix of the bone, making it that much tougher because those fibers seem to be very, very durable, whatever they are.
Right, and we'll pick up on that when we come into our second half of the presentation today. Thank you very much, Lloyd, and get you on the second half.
All right.
Informed, enlightened, alive and amplified. This is the Living Light Network.
Welcome back, audience, to the second half of our show. Our show on today is on the Starchild Skull with special guest Lloyd Pyes. And just before the break, we were talking about the fibers that were found within the skull. Lloyd, could you elaborate more on that, especially from the aspects of your colleague and friend Belinda McKenzie bringing out about the use of mycologists?
Well, when we found the fibers, they were found by a scanning electron microscope. They're very, very, very small. The bone itself is very thin. So when the fibers were found, it was like a great shock because no bone on Earth has fibers like that woven into the matrix of the bone. So your first thought is, when you see anything like that, is that it might be some kind of bacteria or fungus or fungi or just something growing on it, possible. So we took it to mycologists, the data that we had in the pictures, and they said, no, it's not anything. You can see it embedded in the bone. There are parts and certain pictures where you can see that it's actually embedded in the matrix of the bone. They said the things we deal with grow on it. And they may, slip down in the cracks, but they're not actually a part of it, So
Correct.
They said this is just something that's never been seen before, and we don't know what it is. So that was pretty much the answer, and still is the answer. We don't know what those fibers are made of. We just know that they're very durable because they were found because they resisted cutting by the Dremel blade that was used to cut the pieces of bone out of the skull. So they add to the hardness of it by quite a lot. But what's interesting is they're not all the same kind. When you imagine rebar, you think, well, it's all just one thing. They're not. They're different kinds, and you can see different kinds in the different pictures. The fibers are just one of the great, great mysteries of the Starchild, Hildy, and I know that when time goes by, that's one of the aspects of it that will be analyzed, I'm sure, very carefully. People will figure out how to extract the fibers from the bone and then figure out how to test them properly to to find out what they are, but for right now, we really don't know.
Right, and with the use of Raman and other technologies that I'm familiar with, that can easily be accomplished with, I'm going to say pre-existing specimens so that it doesn't have to destroy the bone or anything. You just hit it with a laser and you determine what it is in the library or what it has peaks for so that it could be done. Even a simple test with that by just showing if it has bioluminescence or where it has more light coming back to it, from the laser would be quite interesting to know as compared to a human skull, where it may be more dense and not have that capability that way.
I have no idea. That would be a great thing to know. It would be nice to know it, but that again would be another one of those physical things that it wouldn't matter how bizarre the answer came back. Science would just say, well, nature can do anything, and we'd be to point zero again. You see, It really comes down to DNA. The only thing they will respect is DNA because that's the math of biology. It's like an equation. It says what it says every time, and they can't argue with it. They just can't argue with DNA, and so we have no choice but to just focus all our energies on getting the money we need to do the DNA recovery and sequencing, and then hit the world with it, and then let the chips fall where they may.
Right, and we were going to bring out in reference to the DNA testing how it was approached in two different aspects, regular DNA from the nucleus versus mitochondrial DNA from the mother. And could you elaborate on that?
Right. Well, in the nucleus of all of our cells, except the red blood cells and the sex cells, the trillions of cells that we have in the nucleus of all of them is all of the genomic package that comes to us from each of our parents. That's the 23 chromosomes from mom and the 23 chromosomes from dad to make the 46 chromosomes that are in the nucleus. And in that cell nucleus is approximately 3 billion plus nucleotides to making up base pairs. So it's 3 billion plus base pairs in the nucleus. Floating outside the nucleus of each cell are, imagine like raisins in raisin pudding, just little chips of things that are called mitochondria. And they are energy plants, so they make energy in the cells. They are very specifically 15,000 15,000 or 16,569 base pairs long. Mm-hmm. I've drawn a blank there for a minute, but anyway, it's always the same number of base pairs in the mitochondria. Always the same thing, and that comes from the mother only. It comes down from the mother. In the nucleus, remember, we have the 23 chromosomes from mom, the 23 chromosomes from dad, the whole package from mom and dad. But the mitochondria, the 15,569 base pairs from that comes only from mothers. Why? Because sperm is only the 23 chromosomes from dad with a tail attached. The egg of the female, and we've all seen when a sperm attacks an egg to go in and fertilize it, the egg looks like the moon by comparison. Right. It's much, much bigger. So the egg is carrying the mitochondria that the being that's going to be formed is going to be using for the rest of its life. So the sperm delivers the 23 chromosomes that are going to go in the nucleus with females, also the egg is carrying 23 chromosomes. So those are going to blend, match together, fuse together, and form the nucleus, and the egg is going to supply the mitochondria that being is going to have. So as we sit here talking, we have the mitochondria that our mother had, that our grandmother had, that our great-grandmother had, or great-great-great-great-great-grandmother had, with very few changes between great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother and now. It doesn't change much. Why? Well, let's go back for a minute to the nuclear DNA. Of those 3 billion base pairs that make up the nuclear DNA, about 95% of it has no use that is understood. It's referred to as non-coding DNA now. It used to be called junk DNA, but people got kind of up in arms about calling it junk. So they call it non-coding, but it's the same thing. We run on about 5% of the genes in our body run us, do things that science can determine it has a use. 95% of it is like just sitting there doing something we don't understand at present. To call it junk indicates it doesn't do anything. That's not true, because the body carefully preserves it, conserves it over time, and it reproduces it again and again and again and again. Each time a cell divides, that part of it, if it was really useless, why would it bother to reproduce
right, and
it's not
like
useless.
Saving it for a rainy day.
Well, we can talk about what it might be later, but for now, just understand that 95% of it doesn't seem to do anything, and so we don't really understand it, and we don't have good data on it. With the mitochondria, it's exactly the opposite. About 95% of it works, absolutely is essential. Anything goes wrong in there, you've got a problem. In a human, if there's some kind of a mutation or a change in the junk DNA and it isn't doing anything, that can stay there and not really do any harm. And so mutations can accumulate in the junk, in the non-coding regions, without really any problems that are noticeable. Whereas if you have a mutation in the 5% that works in the nuclear, then you might notice a change. It might be negative, it might be neutral, it might be positive. And this is what they say, how we evolve is when you have positive changes in there, in the 5% that's working, and it brings some new trait or characteristic that is useful to the species, and that's how supposedly everything evolves. I don't buy into that at all, but that's the theory. Now, with the mitochondrial DNA, it's again different story. 95% is working and works and has to work the same way every time. If anything goes wrong with your mitochondria, you die. You're in trouble. So you only have that 5% where you can have mutations that will stay, can be picked up and accumulated over time. So with the mitochondrial DNA, everybody understands that it changes so seldom, so rare are the changes in it, that they are able to clock them backwards in time. And so mitochondrial DNA is used as a clock, a kind of a clock for the human species. How long have we existed? Now, this is really interesting. Before we were able to check mitochondrial DNA the way we can, science was absolutely convinced, and many still are, that we evolved from a common ancestor with chimps and gorillas and with other higher primates, but that we had a common ancestor at one time 5 to 8 million years ago. Somewhere in that 5 to 8 million year period lived a creature that spawned two creatures. One went on to become chimps and one went on to become us. This is what they say. This business about we evolved from chimps, no, we didn't do that. That's a misnomer. We evolved from a common ancestor that split into us and chimps between 5 and 8 million years ago. So if that's true, which it isn't, but if it were true, then at some point at a considerable distance back in time, humans, that's when our mitochondrial DNA would show itself as human mitochondrial DNA and not chimp mitochondrial DNA, which is very different. So the 1,500 differences between a chimp and a human. So there's a lot. So what do we find, though, when we start looking at our mitochondrial DNA? That it isn't 2 million years ago or 1 million years ago or even 500,000 years ago. At about 200,000 years ago only does our mitochondrial DNA kick in the way as we understand it, and we are us as we understand us, only at about 200,000 years ago. When this was found in the mid-1980s, it was just a huge scandal. Arguments flew between the anthropologists who were absolutely convinced by the theory of the bones and the theory of evolution that couldn't be right, and the geneticists, of course, are very clear on what they're coming up with in their laboratories, and they're saying, no, this is it. I mean, this is the way it is, like it or lump it. This was a big, big shift in our thinking about our origins when we had to face up to the fact that there is no real clear sign that we came from a common ancestor in the past. Science just now, they've come up with a, quote, bottleneck theory to try to explain it, that there was a genetic bottleneck that there's no evidence for, that nobody can really account for it, except that just it had to be there. If the DNA evidence is going to match up with evolution, there has to be a bottleneck. And that's just the way it is, and so they made it up as a theory to fit the evidence rather than using the evidence and trying to come up with a theory that actually works. But anyway, that's an aside. So the mitochondrial DNA gives us, comes from the mother, and it shows us clearly what human mitochondrial DNA looks like. And with human mitochondrial DNA, the maximum amount of differences, the maximum amount of mutations that are found in 30 haplogroups. We're divided into now 30, maybe 33 haplogroups now, 35. Depends on who you talk to, but let's just say 30. Just round it off at 30. 30 different haplogroups, meaning a haplogroup has a different amount of differences. A haplogroup can have, let's say, 27 differences. That haplogroup has 27 of these mutations. Another haplogroup has 40. Another haplogroup has 62. It's like that, okay? Mm-hmm. Different haplogroups up to a maximum of 120. The oldest human beings that we have found using the mitochondrial clock are Africans from South Africa, from Southern Africa, Africans. And they have up to 120 of these mutational differences in their mitochondrial DNA. You and I, we probably have 40, 50, 60, 70, somewhere in there, because we would be more recent additions to the species than are the black Africans, who were the first. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, right. With that said, the maximum you're going to find among the humans are 120. With the Neanderthal, they found that they have about 200. So that's an 80 mitochondrial DNA difference, and that's more than enough to say we've got a very, very different species here in the end.
Hello? I don't know if we lost our guest. As he'll be coming back on, somehow we got disconnected. We will talk more pick up with Lloyd Pye in reference to the Neanderthal man. But as we're waiting for him to call back in and you there? You Lloyd?
Yes.
You there?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if maybe it's maybe the receiver wire or something. Sometimes mine gets a little out of adjustment. I have to adjust it, but we lost you there at Neanderthal.
Okay. Did you get the 200 differences versus 120 for Neanderthals?
Yes.
With the mitochondrial DNA?
Yep, we got that, and I appreciate that. We got that. So that
all
means,
right. So
that there's an 80 DNA difference between the oldest South African black species. Humans, and then at the same time versus the primitive man, Neanderthal, which had 200. And also, please note, audience, the fastest way to make a mutation is radiation, chemical exposures, meaning hazardous materials. And then also, if that species was exposed to what I'm going to call mold or bacteria, where there would be mycotoxins, again chemicals, endotoxins, etc., that can predispose the mutation. Lloyd and I had the pleasure of talking about it. It is linked on the page in reference to this show about the Starchild, in reference to the space microbiology section that was done by NASA, and also is printed in the American Microbiology Society, which is bringing out about taking bacteria and putting them into different space vehicles that we've done, and doing experiments in outer space, or putting them in different atmospheres like the Mars atmosphere, et cetera, and then regrouping them. But in this paper, and I hope you do print it and read it, it does state that when the DNA is in a vacuum and has dehydrated, meaning lost its water in its composition, it has more chances of, one, breaking, and at the same time having more toxic effects for mutagenic activity from UV and ionizing radiation, which is, to me, very interesting, Lloyd, because in your Starchild Skull that had more collagen, and more, enamel, because of the spaces, it may have more protection from radiation. In other words, its genetics, when all the answers are in, may be more pure and have a larger DNA count than even the Neanderthal man.
We think so, absolutely, and I'll tell you why. Because, and I was getting to that with what I was talking about. They, in Denosova, Russia, in 2010, the researchers found bones that they assumed were Neanderthal. They looked very much like Neanderthal bones, so they just took a piece of a fingertip just to double check, and they found an incredible result in the mitochondrial DNA. It wasn't 120, it wasn't 200, it was 385 differences. 385 differences. What did that mean? Off that one bone, because mitochondrial DNA is so highly conserved and changes so rarely, they had no choice but, on the strength of that one finger bone, to announce that they had found a whole new species, which is now known as Denosova, or Denosovans, like Neanderthals, Denosovans, and there they are. Now, later they did a tooth. They found a tooth in the same area, and they checked it, and the tooth had the same 385 difference in the mitochondrial DNA. So that is how science has to respect a difference in mitochondrial DNA. Are you with me on that? So if it's that dramatic from 200 to 385, that's 185 difference, and from 120 to 200, 80 difference between us and Neanderthals, you're talking a significant difference between 120 and 385. Now, let's look at the Starchild. We've recovered 4 fragments of the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA. Those 4 fragments add up, and this is covered in detail in the Starchild Skull Essentials ebook. For anybody that wants to check this out, the ebook is very reasonably priced and very easy to get. Get it and look at it and read it.
And it's beautiful with the color pictures and everything. It's beautiful, and I advise any of our audience to definitely put that on your Valentine's
what
list.
You'll see, what you will see is in these 4 fragments taken together, there are a little over 1,500 base pairs of the 15,000 of the mitochondrial DNA. So it's about 9.5%. It is 9.5% recovery, what we have and have analyzed. Of that 9.5%, because mitochondrial DNA is so highly conserved, you can very safely extrapolate the 9.5% out to 100%. And when you do that, the differences are so dramatic between the Starchild and a human that it goes out to about 800 differences. instead of 120, instead of 200, instead of 385. The Starchild sits at about 800. Now, the chimp is out at 1,500. So imagine this line in your mind. From 0 to 1,500, 0, nothing, chimps sitting at 1,500, and at 120 is humans, at 200 is Neanderthals, at 385 is Denosova, and then way over at 800 is the Starchild Skull. Now, can you call that any kind of an aberrant human? No, you cannot. That is an alien. You are looking at an alien's mitochondrial DNA when you look at the Starchilds, the 4 fragments that we have recovered already. Now, is it enough to satisfy? No, it isn't. We need to repeat that again and again and again so that science can't say, oh, you were lucky, oh, you did something wrong, oh, this, oh, that. You know, you have to just cut off all argument, and you do that with multiple runs. But the great thing about DNA is if you get it one time, you're going to get it the next time. There may be slight fluctuations, slight variations, but basically if you get it once, you're getting it again. That's just the way it works. So we know what we're going to get, Hildy. We know what the answer is going to be when we can recover the whole genome. Again, it's just a question of getting the money from some wealthy individual who hears about this and realizes that they can walk into the pages of history in a way that, you know, money just can't buy ordinarily, and in this case it will be able to.
Right, and many, 100 years ago, many of the philanthropists did that. That's how telephone lines got connected, energy, etc. Meaning,
but one of the problems we have is that we can't really, when we get on the mainstream media, whenever we do, it's always on the History Channel or in one of those shows that everybody can easily say, we can't pay any attention to that. We can't get on like the Oprah show or Ellen. She's not there anymore, but Oprah or Ellen DeGeneres or any mainstream outlet that you want to name won't have us because we can't, number one, we can't show that we've got overlaid proof again and again and again, and we're just not definitive. And number two, until it is definitive, we can't tell, that we can't reveal the name of our geneticist or the lab where he works or anything like that because, that they would just be absolutely harassed to death by people trying to tell them, what are you doing? What are you doing trying to help these people do this? Or, all of the leaders and those in positions of authority in science would drop down on them like 2-ton ticks. I mean, they would never be able to get any work done, and this is a big DNA lab. I mean, a big DNA lab, and our guy's the head of the lab. They cannot afford it, and they know they can't. So we have an agreement that we're not going to reveal who they are until they're able to present a paper that can stand up to that kind of scrutiny, which is okay. I mean, that's really the way it has to be, the way it should be. But we'll do it. We are going to do it. Eventually, the right kind of person is going to hear about this. They will, if they want to sign a non-disclosure agreement, of course we'll show them the lab and the geneticist.
As with any funding or anything, those appropriate documents and information would be shared under the appropriate agreements, as I call it, and that's
like you said, stealing is an issue as well. It's not just criticism, but there's also the issue of theft as well. So there are a lot of things that we have to cover ourselves for. We have to look downrange in everything that we do. Because one thing that I've been aware of the whole 13 years since I understood that this really is an alien skull is that history's looking over my shoulder. Everything I do, every decision we make with this has to be right or as close to right as we can get it because there's going to be enough criticism of the mistakes that we've made as it is. I mean, this thing didn't come with an instruction manual, unfortunately, so we've kind of had to figure it out as we go. But I want to keep the mistakes to a minimum if I can, and I've always tried to do that, and I've always tried to do everything as right as I could, as above board as I could, so that when the material will be there that's required.
Well, I'm sorry, Lloyd, but whatever you said after required, I don't think the audience heard.
Oh, gee. Well, I think required was the last word. Yeah, I think required was the last word.
Okay, and I do recognize that, audience, that it is important from what Lloyd and his group and his staff have been doing over these 13 years is that they basically have put together for an unknown skull the ability to show that the scientific validation of it. Whether the peers in the science community are too frightened to approach it or to jump on the bandwagon at this time, that is, to me, their loss. I appreciate every bit of the work that you've done, and I do know that when you have laboratories that are doing scanning electron microscope work or EDS or other types of tests like that, when they put their John Hancock on those analytical results, they're as valid as anything that way, to show that on that day and time that those analyses were correct and run with those requirements for good laboratory practices. I want to bring out something that you touched on at the beginning of the show, and it was brought in reference to the maxilla, where it had multiple teeth that were, audience, which are, one is teeth that were still in the maxilla, like jawline, that did not come out through. In your experience, from what you've read or had to cross paths with studies, like even with the Neanderthal man, did any of the x-rays of other skulls that were out there, not necessarily your skulls, but maybe you have crossed the path of, did they show multiple teeth in the maxima versus audience?
No.
Teeth, but usually in the back. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
No, I've not seen that before. It is a condition in humans. We've researched it fairly well. It is a condition in humans that is not unheard of for someone to gain great age and then have new teeth come in. It can happen. It has happened. It's on record as happening. But it is very, very rare. Normally, it does not. They are, those kinds of people who do that are as rare as, quote, hen's teeth. I always like to throw
right.
that.
Yeah,
But,
I know. I've heard that they've even grown like a whole set of teeth, too, I've heard.
Not a whole set, but they have been one or two or three have come in with people. I know of no account of a full set of teeth coming in for anybody at great age. So it's kind of a rare thing. It is a very rare thing. But with the Starchild, one can imagine, just as a possibility, that its species type lived for a very much longer period of time than we live, and so it might need multiple teeth in the way that sharks, for example, need multiple teeth and can grow teeth whenever they need it.
I agree with that, because I know that in some instances when you remove like a wisdom tooth, a dentist does, sometimes a tooth will grow back, or I'm going to say a piece of bone that would form into it. Not necessarily that it goes into the the root or the tooth canal, the bulb of the tooth where the old one was, the wisdom, but it is in that area of it. And that happens not too often, but it does. But to have so many multiple teeth show up on the X-ray, I'm counting approximately 4.
It looked normal it looked normal, like a normal mouth getting ready to fill itself out. To the guys that that knew about it, they say, yeah, that looks like a child. The way a child looks when they're getting ready to start dropping their teeth and their permanent teeth are going to start coming in. That's how it looks. But it's clear that a child would not have the time to generate the kind of wear and tear that is evident on the teeth of the Starchild, which again you can see, I'm sure, in the close-up clear color pictures in the Starchild Skull ebook. You see very clearly the wear and tear on the teeth, and children just can't generate that kind of torque. They don't have the strength to chew with that level of vigor.
Right, and as audience, as you can remember in your childhood when you had the tooth fairy come to visit you, as your jaw expanded, as you grew, other incisors and other teeth would come in. And some teeth come in, at age 12 and that. So it's very nice to see that overview of it, because I even think if you were able to, the people or maybe a tooth of the ones that regrew back, meaning from a human, maybe there was some genetic, I'm going to say, mutation on the human side or vice versa that possibly could match or not match with your Starchild.
Well, that would be interesting for somebody to do that. Actually, that would be a good test to run. If someone like that can be found, and check and see is there anything different about their DNA that would indicate what caused it, and that's a nice fertile area of research probably.
Yeah, especially when we've got that 385 different DNAs on the other tooth that was just recently found.
Yeah, the nose of the tooth, right?
Yeah, I mean it could be a very good tooth survey, study rather, that way.
Right.
Now, with I also found interesting when the audience has an opportunity to look at your ebook and also the book, and I'm going to reference a specific page which I'm taking out of the Starchild Skull book, The Genetic Enigma, or Human Alien Hybrid. On page, audience and Lloyd, on page 64, it has a picture of the skull, meaning looking at it from making sure it's from the front. But if you look at the Starchild's skull as compared to the other human skull, to me it looks heart-shaped. Did anyone ever make that comment?
I should have said that when I was talking at the very beginning. Ray and Melanie, when they were describing the standard gray alien look, that is the look. It's called heart-shaped. It has the upper lobes of the heart, it has the crease in the top, and it has the dramatic skew down to an almost pointed chin, a very narrow chin area. So it has all of that. It has the very reduced cheekbones. You can see that in the photographs in there. It has the very small maxilla and mouth. It just really does look like the prototypical head of a gray alien and the skull that would be underneath that head. No question about it.
Right, and if the audience ever saw the movie Paul, they would definitely say it looked like Paul's skull that way. Why I'm bringing that out, the heart shape, because of my work with acoustics and harmonic resonance and stuff, by proving, with far infrared, having the inner ear larger, as you discussed earlier on the show, when you're doing telepathic or sending sound and light waves, that it may have a very important factor in doing that or amplifying that resonance of that telepathic sending.
Well, I think that would be more for the receiving rather than the sending. In other words, if it's used to receiving telepathic as well, it would be a much more subtle wavelength, I would think, than is hearing of words like you and I are speaking. So we only need a certain size of inner ear to pick that up and make sense of it. But if we're communicating by telepathy where there is no sound, it's just thought, then maybe you need a much bigger inner ear to receive it. I'm just saying.
That's what I'm going on. You're on my same path, but I'm not using the right words. The thing is, because I think that will be interesting to see in the future with any of those types of studies, that it definitely will pan out to be something related to that, along that line. I also, from the analysis, I know in other shows in that and also in the book you bring out that the skull was found by the young girl who was visiting into Mexico. But I want to bring out to the audience that in the particular area where it was found, approximately, correct me if I'm wrong on the mileage, 150 miles from Chihuahua.
About 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua. About 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua.
Chihuahua, Mexico, for whatever the reason, has the highest incidence of meteorites and activity of that type of nature in that area. I was wondering if, in your thoughts and reading, could that play a portion of anything of the analysis, in particular, like from the metal compositions, if there was ever metal found in the skull?
No, there's no metal has been found in the skull at all, so I don't think that's going to be an issue, and I don't know that the Chihuahua area would figure into it. Another area that's not too far from there, to the southwest, is what they call the zone of silence in Mexico, which is an area where just very strange things happen. They see a lot of UFOs. Planes and compasses and things planes go off course, compasses don't work right, telephones don't work right. The zone of silence is a very strange place there that is not that awful far, 250, maybe 300 miles from where supposedly the Starchild was found. So maybe that's part of it. I don't I don't really know. I can't say. I can only say what I can say, and that's something we can speculate, but I don't know.
Right, and there's no definitive answer on that. It's just that an observation. With the zone of silence, from your experience or your knowledge of that area, or reading about it, how long has it been called the zone of silence? Has it been 900 years or less?
No, I don't know. Yeah, I think it's for more modern times. I don't think it was really recognized as such until a Mexican pilot realized that his plane instruments went out every time he flew over it, a local pilot there, and so he began to experiment and talk about it, and I think out of that, and I think this was maybe the 1930s, ironically enough. I think 30s or 40s, somewhere in there, maybe 50s, but out of that came the name, I think, the Zone of Silence.
Yeah. Well, I personally am going to look into that more so that maybe I can share information with you or get it out to the masses, because I think it's interesting when you can plot, like what you said with the Zone of Silence or the Bermuda Triangle or other areas.
If you want to talk to somebody about that, there's a guy named Ruben Uriarte, Uriarte, Ruben Uriarte, and I think he wrote a book called the Mexican Roswell. And Ruben probably knows as much about oddities and things, strange things going on in Mexico than anybody I know. So, you might want to talk to him about it.
We're going to follow up on that, and thank you very much for the referral.
Not a problem.
Now, in this, you also, which I've done a lot of work with the exposure to nanomaterials, in particular with the exposures to a disease where they call it Morgellons, where fibers grew out of individuals' skin. I think it's on the website and also on the ebook. You brought out that were the findings conclusive that they were similar or not similar or anything?
They're not in the sense that there's no conclusion because we haven't done in-depth research about it, but they're not similar in the sense that Morgellons fibers are usually visible with the naked eye, whereas the fibers that are embedded in the Starchild bone are extremely microscopic relative to human eyesight. And furthermore, Morgellons fibers seem to be disorders of the... Are you there?
I heard disorders of, and that's all I heard.
Yeah, disorders of the skin and viscera and muscle and things like that. So that what you're left with apparently is a disconnect in terms of the size between them. The size of the Morgellons fibers is enormous relative to the fibers in the Starchild, and the Morgellons fibers seem to be, for all intents and purposes, a modern disorder, whereas the Starchild's fibers were found 900 years ago, years ago. So when you add all that up, there does not seem to be a connection.
Right, and that's what I appreciate you bringing out, because of the skull being 900 years old and having those fibers in them, to increase its tensile strength. to me is important in observation and comparative analysis of it. Do you have anything new that is has been done, or you're trying to coordinate beyond the funding and the aspects of doing a documentary?
Yeah, we're looking for the money that we need to do the recovery and to make documentary films so that we can pay back the money. I mean, really, you don't just go to somebody and say, "Hey, we need a couple $1 million to do this work," and they're just going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts. But you say, if you give us this amount of money and we do the work and we make movies and we make the money back and we pay you back and we pay you some profit, then it's a whole different ball game. So we're trying to do it that way because we feel we have the best chance of not only doing everything right the way it has to be done from a scientific standpoint, but we also get to chronicle it very carefully every step of the way to make sure that history has just an ideal record of what went into it and what happened to make the discovery. So both of those things are important, and we hope to do them.
Right. And do you have any lectures coming up soon on speaking engagements or anything? Because I know you do a lot of tours.
I just got back from South Africa in November, and that was the last one that I did. And I don't have anything scheduled for this year. I try not to schedule anything but the largest events, frankly, because I don't like to get tangled up too much with time spent on those. Because I feel like I need to stay free to do what I need to do to try to get the funding arranged for the Starchild, and then once that's done, of course, I'm much freer to do things like that.
Right, and then also open other opportunities in other works that you might be wanting to get involved with.
Yeah, I would like to, exactly. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on this, and I am anxious. I do all that other work in alternative. Intervention theory, other work in alternative knowledge, and I like to focus on intervention theory, which I have an e-book for those who are interested in that. I like hominoids very much. That's Bigfoot, the abominable snowman, and all that, and where they fit into the scheme of things. So I have a whole other area of interest that I really, really am passionate about, and I would like to get back and make as much of a contribution there as I can once the Starchild monkey is off my back, so to speak, and then I'll be able to. I think I'll be a lot happier doing that than I am with the Starchild stuff, just because it's just so frustrating to have very good information, to have them say, well, you need this, you need that, and then we get it, and they just keep raising the bar on us, and we understand that it's just got to be a situation where we just crush them. We can't work with them. We just have to crush them.
Right. And you have to be your own special little team and present it and do it because the macrosphere just doesn't want to hear what the microsphere is.
Exactly. Very well put. That's very well put. Exactly.
Thank you. The other aspect, too, from your analysis that you had of the skull, which was many, did you find less or more environmental pollution factors in it, possibly?
No.
You mentioned earlier that you didn't find any metals or that, but I was wondering if you found anything that we might see like we see now in higher spraying areas where there might be strontium or barium or any of those. You didn't find any of those?
None of that. No, none of that.
Right,
no.
which was proposed to me by a colleague of mine a couple days ago. They were telling me, well, this generation always is blaming, because they can run their iPads, they can do everything, the average 20 to 30-year-old, and blaming it that was our generation that polluted this. And she goes, well, we had clotheslines. We didn't do this. We had this other factors. We grew our food, stuff. So it was quite interesting because the less exposure that you have to exhaust and to other types of environmental pollutants, the better the quality of the specimen, and at the same time, the analysis would show that there was no pollution back then or in those areas. So it's very good in comparative of what you've done with those analyses.
We've got good specimens, really, Hildy, because number one, it was buried in a mine tunnel, so there was no exposure to the elements. I mean, no rain soaking through the soil to leach minerals into the bone or any of that. It was like really burying it. By burying it in a mine tunnel, it was like burying it in a climate-controlled storage locker. We couldn't have asked for better. We couldn't have asked for much better. So we've got, apart from the natural degradation of the decay process of death, apart from that, and, of course, a lot of people handling the skull, a lot of humans handling it over time, inevitable, but other than that, it's in good shape. I mean, the fragments come out in the hundreds of base pairs long. So those are good fragments. I mean, there are plenty of them, and we just have to get the money to get them all. We've got enough in hand to know what the answer is going to be. It's clear. The nuclear that we've recovered over 30,000 base pairs in fragments. And when you send it to the NIH, some of it comes back clearly human, some of it comes back not seen on Earth. That's exactly what you'd expect for an alien. Because people need to understand, when aliens are found, they're going to have the same DNA code, the same life code, the same biology that we have here on Earth. There can't be multiple codes. Now, you will hear people say, oh, well, no, we have one on Earth, and if it happened anywhere else, they're going to have theirs, and it could be based on silicon or based on carbon or who knows what. So I don't believe that. I believe there is one form of life everywhere, so that when you find species from other planets, like the Starchild, there is going to be enough in it that is going to be similar to what you find on Earth, to where you're going to see that the code is the same, but there's also going to be enough about it that will be magnificently different, so that you'll know for sure it wasn't from Earth. And we already have that with our 30,000 base pairs in fragments. The NIH is already telling us that's what we're going to have. We're going to have part of it is human-like, but not human, but Earth-like. Let's put it that way, Earth-like.
Right.
But
and it would be
chimps
Earth-like. What I was
going to say. Okay, let me finish. Chimps have 95% the same genome that humans have. Chimps. Chimps have 97 to 98% the same. 98 to 97% the same genome that humans have. Gorillas have 95%. Rats have 70%. Mice, 65%. Yeast, 20%. You see what I mean? It's all there. The parts, you can find human-like corollaries across every mammal species, because we're all functioning the same way with the same life code. Now, the Starchild is going to be like that too, and any other alien out there. I don't care whether it's reptiles or grays or whatever, insectoids, their life code is going to be the same as the life codes of creatures on Earth. I'm convinced. Now, I can't prove it yet, but the code is so complex, it's so complicated, I can't conceive of it being other than a template for the universe, at least for the galaxy, probably for the universe. And so when you look inside the Starchild's genome, you're going to find as much as 50%, perhaps. Our geneticist is estimating just wildly between 50% and 90% the same. But if it's 90%, the upper limit, it's twice as much as a gorilla, and if it's 50%, the lower level, it's less than a rat or a mouse. So it's going to fall in that range somewhere, but well away from human. And so, therefore, there's no way you can call it anything but an alien. The Starchild is an alien skull, or the skull of an alien. In my mind, there is no doubt, based on the nuclear DNA recovery and the mitochondrial DNA fragments that we've recovered up to now, we have more than enough to present to an investor and say, here, look, you can't lose. This is a lead pipe cinch. And it is.
Right, and even if it was, I'm going to say, an alien life form, but a cloned life form, so that it would stay here versus being part of another species out in the universe, that is even historical that way, because it's 900 years old.
Right. Well, if you could prove, I don't know how you're going to prove that it's cloned, but if you could, at 900 years, they're alien. That proves alien reality on a much larger scale than I'm sure science would feel comfortable dealing with them. It's going to be bad enough dealing with it at the level of 900 years ago. One here,
right,
900
right.
years ago.
900 years ago, and living proof, by meaning having the skull and matching comparative analysis and also genetic analysis that's even showing by our National Institute of Health that it doesn't match the human, So I think that's all important, and even sharing that information with us is very important. And I love and respect what you call the life code, because it can be easily the template of the crystal or the DNAs of what it is, so that it is the template of where that life form originated, and also what does that life form need to have or augment in its life form to be sustainable here on this planet. Meaning our oxygen, or like you could go to another planet and it could be a different atmosphere. But what I'm saying is that's well put in explaining that for the audience, because I know that with all the quickening that we're all experiencing in each one of our fields and the interdisciplines of how that knowledge is expanding and information coming out, I wouldn't be surprised if you got funded and had all these answers before 12/21/2012 as we go through the galactical universe,
Well, all it it's really an overnight thing. The right person hears it at the right time in the right way, and we're underway. It's just that quick. So everything else is in place. We have our director, we have our accountant, we have our lawyer, we have a business set up. Everything's set up. We just need the money.
Yeah, well, that's going to come. We're going to put some little prayers out there and make it happen. Because I like to see, Lloyd, from the thought of my telepathy, how fast does it become the reality? So that's another experiment we can do.
Absolutely.
So
make it happen.
It's very good. We're coming up onto the hour, Lloyd. Do you have any other things that you would like to share with the audience?
No, just that anybody that wants to find out about this can go to www.starchildproject.com to get the Starchild ebook or the book, and you can go to www.LLOYDPYE.com to find out about Lloyd, LLOYD PYE, to find out about intervention theory and get the intervention theory ebook that's available there. Both are reasonably priced, and both are very, very worthwhile, I think, checking into.
Yes, and I read the ebook on the Starchild, and it's very well done, and also beautiful pictures, audience, so that you can see them in living color and the resolution. It's very good for our future junior scientists and engineers to prove, in addition to go beyond, so that they can prove the life codes, Lloyd. I wish you well. I want you to have wonderful trips in the future, and I want to see how fast that funding comes. Okay? Thank you very much for being my guest.
Thanks so much, Hildy. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. And audience, look at the website of One Cell, One Light so you can see the additional references. Okay? Bye-bye.
Informed, enlightened, alive and amplified. This is the Living Light Network.
Welcome, audience, to the One Cell, One Light radio show with your host, Dr. Hildegarde Staninger, commonly known as Dr. Hildy. Today's show is going to be very special. I have a very special guest that is on the show who has pioneered in the identification of the DNA and other scientific validation tests and approaches in medicine to the topic of our show today, the Starchild Skull. And my special guest is Mr. Lloyd Pyes, and I would like to introduce him here at this time.
Thank you, Hildy. It's a very, very great pleasure to be with you. You do great work with your show, and I'm delighted to be a part of it.
I'm glad that collectively we're making history together, and with your special Starchild Skull, she's giving us history to look at, and at the same time share her life. And I'm just going to share with the audience that when you did your original testing, and we'll go into the history of where she was found and everything, but she's approximately 900 years old by carbon dating. Is that correct?
Yes, that part of it is correct, Hildy. It was indeed 900 years by carbon-14 dating of the two skulls that were found at separate times in separate labs. But I have to say that the Starchild Skull, we don't know its sex. We don't know if it was a male or a female, so we generally refer to it as an it. Unfortunately,
okay.
It isn't either one, and it's misleading to just pick a side like the universal male or the universal female. In this case, it's better to just go with the it and leave it at that until we're able to distinguish for sure what its sex was.
And I appreciate that very much, because I like being scientifically correct on the terms. At the same time, I appreciate that. I just, because she... Well, let me, before I share what I know and I read in your book, and audience, Lloyd has written this beautiful book, well documenting the scientific validations that are proposed in the book, and also what scientists and medical professionals, physicians, etc., have observed.
So that is still what experts pretty much hang their hats on, that, well, it's got to be, it has expanded parietals, it has to be the result of hydrocephaly, and it has a flat rear of its head, and it has to be cradle-boarded, and that's that, and don't bother us anymore. And we've been living with that now for 13 years. But nonetheless, back to the story. So Ray and Melanie were told by experts it was a cradle-boarded hydrocephalic, and just forget about it, not special at all. And so they would not take no for an answer. And so they began to look around for somebody in the field of alternative knowledge who knew a little bit about skulls, and my name came to them, and they invited me to come take a look at it. And when I saw it, I thought, too, that it had to be some kind of deformity, because if it wasn't, if it was what Melanie thought, if it was the skull of a gray alien, then, that was like finding the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I just didn't think that I was going to take a place in history of that size. And yet, by the end of that, and that was in February of '99, by the end of that year, they offered it to me, and they said, we want to know what it is. If you'll take it out and take it to experts and find out, we'd appreciate it. And I said, sure, I want to find out too. So I began to take it to experts of varying kinds, various experts with various parts of human skulls. And in every case, the experts would say, well, I have to admit, I can't explain my part of it, but it's all together, it's got to be some kind of deformity. But yeah, I've never seen eye sockets like this, or yeah, I've never seen inner ears like this, or yeah, the bone's really too thick, or yeah, the brain clearly is not like our brain, and every one of them, his area would never seen anything like it, but collectively it had to be some kind of deformity. Well, by the end of all that, I understood that there's not a single physical feature of the Starchild Skull, not a single physical feature of the Starchild Skull that is exactly like a human, not one. And so I knew by the end of that year that we had something very, very special there. But what the mainstream people kept saying to me when I would try to say, hey, look, this thing is incredible. This is amazing. You should be jumping all over this. And what that would say is, look, no matter what you come up with on this, we are able to say with perfect authority, nature can do anything. Nature can do absolutely anything nature puts its mind to doing. And so there's what she called it misshapen. It was a misshapen skull, misshapen hands, misshapen body. Misshapen was her word when she described it later in life. She managed to get the two skulls back into the States, and she kept them as souvenirs for her whole life. There's more to the story than that. I'm just giving you the shortened version.
Right, you're giving us the condensed version.
The condensed version. She brought them back. She kept them basically in a cardboard box her whole life, just as souvenirs. She shellacked them to preserve them, which was a good thing because it preserved the DNA very well. And so she found out she was going to die in the early 90s, and she wanted somebody to keep the skulls. Her husband wasn't very comfortable with them, so she gave them to some friends. They kept them for about 5 years. They weren't that comfortable with them, and in 1998, they gave them to Ray and Melanie Young. Now, Melanie, Melanie was had been a neonatal nurse for about 15 years. Up to this point, everybody assumes that the strange-looking skull is just some kind of human deformity that they don't know the name of, but it's got to be that, and that's the end of it. Melanie knows better. She knows what deformity is supposed to look like. She knows this is not a normal human deformity. It's very symmetrical. Everything about it that she can see surface-wise is different. It's too light. It's way too light for a normal human skull. In every way, Melanie is convinced this is not a typical human deformity. And more than that, she and her husband Ray are members of El Paso MUFON, Mutual UFO Network organization. So they know a little bit about UFOs, and more than a little bit, in fact. And so she says, this skull looks like it would fit perfectly in the head of your standard, typical, prototypical gray alien. And he said, you're right. And it was true. It has the large bulbous area in the crown, but with a crease down the middle of it. It has the very narrow lower face that comes almost to a point. In every way, and it has weird, strange eye sockets. So in every way, it just seemed to have the outward trappings of your typical gray alien skull. So they took it to a couple of experts, quote, experts in the El Paso area who should have known what they were looking at, and they said, this is just a cradle-boarded hydrocephalic, don't worry about it. They both said the same thing, and which I heard later many times and still do to this day. You will hear experts try to say that it's a cradle-boarded hydrocephalic.
About the skull and categorizing it, because we're looking at it as an unknown skull because it doesn't fit necessarily the normal human skull, no matter what the ethnic background is or the race is. And his book is The Starchild Skull, Genetic Enigma or Human Alien Hybrid. Very well written, a lot of information in it. So if you're looking at not only just human genetics and that aspect, but have a yearning for finding the unknown and possibly looking at other lives in other planets or other worlds, this is a very good book on allowing you to see how it was done scientifically to bring it to this date and time of the information involved around basically these two skulls. And I'm going to let Lloyd share with the audience the history of the skulls so they'll know what about them.
Well, the history is that they were found in about 1930 in a backcountry of Mexico, about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua, up near the Copper Canyon area, not in the Copper Canyon area per se, but close to it, like say Flagstaff relative to the Grand Canyon, high desert area. And it was just a small village that a girl of Mexican extraction was visiting in about 1930, but her parents had already come to the States and had moved to El Paso, Texas. So the family was coming back after they had gotten legal, and where the kids were coming to the village for the first time, and so they were told not to go out and look in the caves and mine tunnels in the area because it was dangerous. And so, of course, being a teenager, about 13, 14, 15, she couldn't remember later in life, she snuck off to see what it was all about. And in one of the mine tunnels, she found two skeletons, one lying on the surface of the mine tunnel, and she could see a mounded up amount of dirt beside it, and coming out of that mound of dirt was a skeletal hand wrapped around the upper arm bone of the skeleton lying on the dirt. So she scraped the dirt away. It was loose. It wasn't compacted by rain or anything. So with her hand, she was able to expose the skeleton in the dirt, which she found to be very unusual. And she assumed, as anybody would in 1930, that it was just some kind of weird deformity, phallic, when in fact, instantly you can tell, anybody that knows anything about either malady can tell it's neither cradle-boarded nor hydrocephalic, because hydrocephaly is water on the brain, which is actually spinal fluid on the brain, but it creates uniform pressure. As the pressure builds, it's uniform. It's like blowing up a balloon. There are no creases left in a hydrocephalic skull, and you look at the Starchild, and right away you see that crease in the top of the crown, and you know that couldn't be the result of hydrocephaly. And as far as cradle boarding, that's strapping an infant's head to a board so it can be put on the back of the mother as she has to work. And because the child's child's skull bones are so soft, they take the flattened shape of the rear of the head. And you can look at and they're as flat as the board. The head ends up as flat as the board that it's pressed against. It's tied down to. Starchild has.
Excuse me, Lloyd, but with cradle boarding, which is another feature that was brought out in your book, that a normal human skull audience usually have what they call between the eye sockets an L shape, and the Starchild skull did not have that L shape. But with cradle boarding, which is done in 100 years or longer through Native American heritage, they would use the cradle board, but the eye sockets would be the same, L shape.
Sure, nothing would change except the flattening of the rear of the head to the smoothness of a board. But the Starchild clearly has all of its natural convolutions back there. But more importantly, cradle boarding, the board could go only as far as the inion at the rear of the head. If everybody listening to me right now just reaches around to the middle of the rear of your head, you'll feel a knot, an absolutely distinctive knot back there. It's called your inion. And right below it, you'll feel the muscles of your neck because that's where your neck attaches. That inion is a buttressing element for big muscles that attach there. So the cradle board could not go beyond that inion, could not go, because then it would rip the neck muscles loose. That wasn't going to happen. So that's where the flattening stops, just above the inion. Starchild doesn't have an inion, so its flattening goes right down to its neck, to the foramen magnum, to where its spine comes into its skull. Again, anybody that knows anything about this could see that this is not standard cradle